welcome. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate you spending time on a Sunday. Looks like you're even in the office, so good for you.
I write to my office on important events. So
Goodness.
I've been writing
I
to the
have,
office for 7 months.
it's been,
You can see my bike in the background.
I see, I've seen some of your videos. In fact, I've watched several of your videos. It's been a real pleasure to see you really taking on the science and getting the word out. I think it's so important that so many, that we as physicians leverage this social media, because I think this is the best tool we have, quite honestly. And I know you've kind of aligned yourself with Jason Fung's group, the IDM folks. Are you still actively doing cardiology as well? I'm unclear as to what you're doing these days.
Yeah, so there's an overlap, right? As you know, a lot of patients with cardiac issues, in fact, every single patient who's got cardiac issues is either insulin resistant, dyslipidemic, diabetic. So they need kind of a cardiac evaluation of sorts. But the way my life was structured for the first 25 odd years is that I would spend about 50 to 70% of my time in the cardiac cath lab. Now I probably spend about 10% of my time in the cath lab. So 90% of the time is dedicated to counseling patients, evaluating them for insulin resistance, and also non-invasive imaging techniques to see if they have coronary disease, those kinds of things. And then also creating content, YouTube content that people can see and perhaps kind of grasp where I'm going to take them in a visit, in a one-on-one counseling session, because all of that is supplemental information. It's hard to cover a large amount of information in a one-on-one visit in an office.
No, I agree. I definitely have been there, and I know it's very challenging because you have a limited amount of time. If you go from 75% of your time in the cath lab to 10% of your time in the cath lab, that hurts the bottom line quite a bit, I would imagine, because as we know, proceduralists get, that generates a lot more revenue. So has that been something that's been received poorly among the hospital, the places where you do, the cath labs where you do your work? Or how's the response to that been?
Well, the only person it's really affected poorly is me and my family. The hospital is quite happy with it because all the procedures that I generate are now being done by a young colleague that we have associated with. So I have now an association with a young guy who just came out of training, and another guy who's 5 years out. I would not get my patients to be worked on by somebody who is not at a level that I think is very, very good, because when you do coronary interventions, about 90% of the time things can go right, but 10% of the time can be real disasters. And I don't want any of my patients to go through disasters. So hospital is happy with me because I still supply them with a large amount of volume.
So as long as it gets done, as long as the casts are being done, then they're happy. I want to get it because there's so many topics that I know you've been interested in, Nadir, and one I want to talk about a couple of them that are things that I've kind of thought were interesting that you mentioned. I want to talk this concept of these people that are resistant to becoming fat adapted. These people that have been so dependent upon glucose metabolism to the exclusion that it is very, very, very difficult to get them to, kind of switch over to a more quote unquote metabolically flexible or a fat utilization. I saw a video that you kind of alluded to that. I can't remember if you went into that in great detail, but are you seeing that being how often are you seeing those types of people, and what do you think they need to do differently than someone that sort of more easily goes into, producing ketones and maybe not quite dealing with such heavy dependent upon glucose metabolism and insulin resistance?
It's a fascinating question, and I think because we are trailblazing an area in which I don't think the adaptation of low carb has ever had so many great minds working together. And so we continue to refine this area because, as you know, there are many people who are have weight stalls, who don't get the same degree of benefit from going on a low carb diet, who find it very hard to do intermittent fasting. So rather than tell these people the same thing that the mainstream medicine has said, it's your fault, you don't have enough willpower, you don't have enough resilience, you are morally corrupt. I think that the paradigm we should take is that what's going on with these guys? Are their satiety signals right? Is their insulin signaling right? What is the crosstalk between insulin and glucagon? What is happening to the fat that is released from the fat cells? Is the liver picking that up and converting that to glucagon? Is that fatty acid being used by the muscles? And if it's not being used by the muscle, is the fatty acid converting to toxic fat, which we now call ceramide, or it has been called ceramide for some time. And ceramide gets into the cells, it destroys the beta cells that make insulin. It makes insulin resistance worse in many, many different locations. So this is an all-encompassing question as to who is insulin resistance and why are they insulin resistance. And it's not a homogeneous disorder, it's a heterogeneous disorder. And how do you tease it out? I don't think any of us have the right answers, but we are beginning to scratch the surface. A person who is insulin resistant, does he need to do a lot of intermittent fasting? If he's not doing intermittent fasting, is this individual somebody who needs to improve their insulin receptor through exercise? I don't know the answer. I don't pretend to know the answer. I know that I'm trying out a few tricks in some of these individuals, but I think you are asking a more specific question. So I'll let you redirect me in the right location, because right now I'm giving you kind of a very global view. So did you have a specific patient in mind that you were thinking that this applies to?
Well, I think there's there are people that I think, and you kind of alluded to some of these people where they kind of stall out. You put them on a low carbohydrate diet. I mean, I see in the topic of ceramides. I've covered that with Ben Bickman quite a bit. I know Ben's done a lot of work with that, and it's quite interesting. And we see that maybe palmitic acid might be one of the guys involved in that, and we see that often as a result of de novo lipogenesis. Jeff Volek showed that ingestion of saturated fat doesn't necessarily correlate with saturated fat in the blood. I know you've said that if you are obese, if you are insulin resistant, then gorging on fat is not going to be necessarily the answer. And I agree. And I think it's, in my view, it comes to, and I know you like a lot what Ted Naiman says. It does tend to come to an energy overload, whether that's energy overload from carbohydrates and then secondary de novo lipogenesis or conversion to fatty acids through just too much, because there's some people out there suggesting that carbohydrates have zero role in development of insulin resistance, which I strongly push back against. But I do think also fats can do that too if you eat too much. Now the question is, again, it's the satiety issues. Some people seem to be very satiated on a higher fat approach, where others can eat enough to where they can actually gain weight and become obese. And I wonder if it's certain. So this is, when we talk about how do we fix things, you can deplete. It's very easy. We know how to deplete glycogen very easily. I mean, we exercise, we fast, we don't eat as much carbohydrate or secondarily perhaps even some of the gluconeogenic precursors. We can deplete our glycogen pretty quickly. How do we deplete the ceramide? How do we fix that issue is another different topic. As you know, Some people will have triglycerides in their muscle tissue, which is not necessarily a problem. Athletes show that that's not necessarily pathologic, but when we see the ceramides interfering with the, say, the serine kinase, and causing this insulin receptor to be, functioning incorrectly as an issue. Now, one thing I'm seeing, Nadir, and I know you've talked about not eating fat, but I'm seeing protein, and I'm a protein guy, and I think Ted Naiman does some good work, but I am seeing people with consistently higher protein or consistently higher levels of protein seeing more glucose. And I think it's not necessarily gluconeogenesis, because I think it's a slow process. I think it's probably glucagon insulin mismatch, because our liver is insulin resistant, but it seems like glucagon is still being stimulated, and the inhibition of glucagon by the incretins is not happening as readily. So I've been really diving into this, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. So why would you? So the observation I have, because I have the opportunity to spend every single morning, 7 days a week, with 50, 60, 70 people sometimes, and ask them pointedly what's working for you, what's not. And what we're seeing, at least in the diabetic population, is when they go higher fat, but within a caloric constraint, that they have very nice glucose control. We've got type 1 diabetics with hemoglobin A1Cs of 4.6, 4.8. And I know you like to look back in history. There's a guy named Louis Newberg who did a bunch of pioneering work in the 1920s, just before insulin was invented. I'm not sure if you've read his three studies from 1920, 21, and 23.
Oh.
But his treatment option was 1,000 calories, 90% fat, 25, 20% or 10% protein. For a week or two, he would get these people that were severe type 1 diabetics with, glucoses of 600. These guys were in comas, they had sepsis, they had infections. These were life-threatening, end-stage, dying type 1 diabetics. And within a week or two, he would take these people down to normal, or at least they were no longer having glycosuria. They were largely normal glycemic. And then they were able to sustain it. Then he would ramp their calories back up over, a period of, 2 or 3 months, where they'd get them back up to 2,500 calories or something like that. And the odd thing that struck me is he said he found that was even more effective than fasting for some of these people. So I know that fasting has been beneficial for many people, but I just thought that was a curious thing. And I wonder if you'd had any thought or experience on that.
So 2 fascinating questions you asked me. I'm not familiar with Newberg's work. It's something that I should look into, and it's fascinating what he has done. But I want to unpack 2 questions you asked. The one question was about ceramide. How could you potentially reduce ceramide? How could you direct fatty acids, instead of being converted to ceramide through joining with serine? And that's one. And the second question you asked was that people who eat a lot of protein still get a little increase in sugar, and or glucose, is that related to insulin glucagon interactions, and what are those? So I'll take one at a time. I think that for you to prevent the formation of ceramide, you have to take the fatty acids that are released from the fat cells and burn it in the muscles, or the liver should take up the fatty acids and not re-esterify them and put them back out as VLDL, but should convert them to ketones. So when the liver is functioning appropriately, when it is not converting the fatty acids that are released back into VLDL, it takes 80% of the fatty acids and converts them to ketones. A liver that is taking the fatty acids and re-esterifying them is severely insulin resistant. So my bet is, and I don't think there's any real research that has been done to back this up, is that there is a situation of high fatty acids in the setting of starvation and fasting in bloodstream. There is a situation of high fatty acids in somebody who is insulin resistant. Because when you're insulin resistant, it's not just alteration in your sugars, but your adipose tissue gets affected. And adipose tissue cannot contain the fatty acids inside itself. An insulin-resistant fat cell is inflamed. It is spewing fatty acids into the bloodstream. So in some ways, starvation and insulin-resistant adipose tissues are same. They are releasing a lot more fatty acids into the circulation. The question is, why is those two situations different? Why is insulin-resistant people forming ceramides, and why are people who are fasting not making ceramides? And I think the reason that has to do is that in the fasted state, your insulin signaling is fantastic. Your muscles are primed to take up the fatty acids and burn it directly. So the fatty acids, it's not going down the pathway of ceramide formation. They're going the pathway through oxidation and conversion to ketones. So this is something that some bright PhD research assistant should design a study and demonstrate to us. Okay, so now let me take the, and I'm so happy, Shawn, that you are asking me questions about all the recent content that I put out, because I've been fascinated by that. And we should pause for a second and recognize that one of the heroes of our movement, somebody who has taught us a lot, passed away about 2 to 3 weeks ago, and that's Dr. Roger Unger, because he is the guy from Touchstone Diabetes Center in Dallas who defined the paracrine interaction between insulin and glucagon. So in our pancreas is insulin producing beta cells and glucagon producing alpha cells that are in close juxtaposition. They are in proximity to each other. And the insulin that is released acts on glucagon in a paracrine effect. In other words, a large concentration of insulin reaches the alpha cells, which are right adjacent. So paracrine means right next to each other. An endocrine effect is a hormone released at the level of the gland and having an action in a distant organ, far removed. Paracrine is adjacent effect right next to each other. And if you look at the concentration of insulin at the level of alpha cells that are making glucagon, it's about 4,000 times that in the periphery. By the time the insulin reaches the liver, it's been diluted about 10-fold already, and it goes through a further dilution after it reaches the liver, after it leaves the liver and reaches the peripheral circulation. So what I have been doing over the last 6 months in people who have specific clinical features is to measure their glucose level, their insulin level, their glucagon level in the fasted state. Then I tell them, hey, go and eat what you really eat on a regular basis, whether it's low carb, high protein, and high fat, or in somebody who is not tuned into low carb diet, eat what you want to eat. And 30 minutes later, 30 minutes to an hour later, it's a little hard to time it because of the lab, but between 30 minutes and 60 minutes, we repeat the same tests. And that gives a fantastic evaluation of how your pancreas is responding to food. I really think that eating is a very stressful situation for the body. And the reason it is stressful is that you are ingesting a large amount of protein, a large amount of fat, and in a standard American diet, a large amount of carbohydrates. And the body is given all these stress signals. And the stress signals are that, hey, dispose of the carbs. We don't want your sugar levels to go up. Dispose of these amino acids that you have absorbed. We don't want amino acid levels to be high either. Somehow make sure that the fat is packed into the fat cells. And the body has to mobilize so many different things to maintain homeostatic balance in sugar and amino acids and in fats. So eating is a very stressful situation. And if your pancreas is not up to it, then what can happen is the following. So let's take specific scenarios. Let's take an obese individual, a person who is BMI 35, who's got insulin resistance, who's got high triglycerides, who's got elevated blood sugars, maybe not dramatically, maybe hemoglobin A1C of like 6.3, considered to be in the pre-diabetic category. What happens to these individuals? Let's say they go on a low-carb diet, they have eaten a large amount of fat and large amount of protein. So in these specific individuals, protein, as you know, increases your insulin levels. Not quite as much as glucose does. Glucose increases insulin levels a little early. Protein reaches the same level as glucose, but maybe reaches a little later. So the peak happens over a longer period of time. And if it's not quite 100% out of glucose, it may be about 90%. So one of the first things for us to realize is that insulin is released when you eat protein as well. Many people did not know that. Now, in this particular individual, the insulin goes up and the sugar goes up along with the insulin. Now, what does that tell you? What that tells you is that despite an increase in insulin, the body's insulin signaling is so bad that it is not able to keep the sugar levels down. But you also have to take a look at the glucagon levels in these people. So the glucagon levels that at fasted state were high, but not dramatically, they go up dramatically with the presence of protein. So the high glucagon in this situation is now increasing the glucose output from the liver rather than reducing it. It is taking those amino acids that this person has eaten, or taking amino acids that are being released from proteolysis, from protein breakdown, and converting them to glucose. Or it's converting some of the stored glycogen from different places into glucose. So like you say that gluconeogenesis happens very slowly. The glucose should not go up so dramatically, so quickly. I'm not sure. I have not looked into that data. I don't know how long it takes. Dr. Unger seems to think that in people who are severely sick, who are catabolic, when they are given a protein meal, their glucose levels will shoot through the roof because of gluconeogenesis. But what period of time that takes, I'm not sure.
I think, let me insert here. I think it's because of glycogenolysis. I think because, as you know, one of the roles of glucagon is to promote both gluconeogenesis, but it also, spills glucose from the liver for the glycogen breakdown. And I think the glycogen breakdown is why you see that happening acutely. The strongest, most potent stimulants of glucagon are protein, exercise, or stress hormones, and then low blood glucose. And I think what we're seeing is while the protein slowly can refill that glycogen storage over a period of, because it's not even absorbed very slowly. It doesn't even leave the stomach for many, many hours, as it's being broke down. So I think that the acute response is almost certainly due to, in my view, glycogenolysis from hepatic stores under the influence of glucagon. And I think, like you pointed out, that even though insulin rises in response to proteins, it's not effective because the liver's insulin resistant, the muscles are insulin resistant. There was a paper I read, and I wish I could find it again. I didn't bookmark it, but talking about that they think the main driver of hyperglycemia in the diabetic is not so much the failure to uptake glucose into the muscle, but it's because of the hepatic output. And we have non-insulin dependent ways of getting glucose into the muscle outside of the GLUT4 receptor. Now, exercise certainly improves the GLUT4 receptor. We know it translocates to the membrane surface when you exercise. But I personally think it's glycogenolysis from glucagon stimulation is what, from the timing standpoint. And you know, when you look at the isotope data on gluconeogenesis, it's a very slow process, and glycogenolysis is a very rapid process. So it makes more sense to me in that regard.
Yeah, I learned from you, Shawn, from all these observations that you're pointing out, and I'm glad that I think that I would completely agree with you. Another topic that we should touch on, not right now, because we are on the tangent of, we are focused in on looking at insulin-glucagon interactions, is how the hormones that are elaborated by the stomach, the duodenum, how these hormones give signals for satiety, how they give signals for the pancreas to release its hormones even before, like you pointed out, the amino acids have not even been absorbed. The glucose has not even been taken over, but the GIP has already made the pancreas release insulin into the circulation in anticipation of food entering the circulation. So the whole thing about nutrient homeostasis and interaction between the gut and the gut hormones and the pancreas and the brain is something that the low carb community should be at the forefront and try to explore. So I'll leave that little thought in people's mind so that they can think about that. But let's take a little further for this individual. Now, we said that insulin went up with protein, but sugars paradoxically went up. Glucagon went up quite a bit. And despite the glucagon going up, there was an interaction in such a way that the fatty acids that these people have did not get taken up and get converted to ketones. I think that these fatty acids in these people are re-esterified, their VLDL goes up, and some of those fatty acids are taken and made ceramide. So I think, and I'm speculating a little bit here, and my speculation is that if you see a low-carb individual and he eats proteins, their insulin goes up, but their sugar goes up, glucose goes up, their glucagon goes up, that I think is a relatively bad situation. And that's the situation in which we need to correct. And the correction should be that with the rise in insulin, the sugar levels should not go up from their baseline. If the sugar levels are going up with the rise in insulin, that is a pretty poor situation for this patient. Now, I have seen the contrary. I've seen very rapidly keto people who are physically very active. They put in enormous amounts of time either on their bike or they're avid runners or they're weightlifters. And these people have very low fasting insulin levels, sometimes less than 4, 2.5, 3. Now with the 2.53, their sugar levels are very low. They're not high at all. Now when they eat a protein meal, now I was surprised. This is all new information that I don't think anybody really has. With their protein meal, usually you should expect, according to the data, that insulin should go from 3 to 30, somewhere in that range, 30 to 50. But their insulin goes from 3 to 13, 3 to 10, 3 to 15, not high at all. But what's happening to their sugar levels? Their sugar levels do not rise at all. Even though their glucagon level is going up, their sugar levels is not rising. And the reason for that is that small increase in insulin is effective in them because these people are insulin sensitive. Their insulin signaling is so good that that small rise in insulin took care of the sugar. It didn't let it rise up high at all. So I think that is a healthy insulin, glucagon, and glucose interaction that we should be looking at. And we should try to figure out this paracrine effect interaction. And in addition to just adding sugar and glucagon and insulin, I should now try to measure their fatty acids in the circulation, perhaps measure specific ones like stearic acid, palmitic acid, like you pointed out, because this is all the information that we need to know so that we can take it a step further. So I think we covered both those questions to our level of understanding right now, with a large amount of speculation also added to that, because nobody in the world has data on this.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree. This is stuff that merits further study. I do like the fact that you point out the role of the incretin hormones. I mean, as we know, a lot of diabetics are missing phase 1 incretin hormone secretion, which kind of parallels some of the things we see. We know that incretins stimulate pancreatic release of insulin more so than blood glucose. I think that's fascinating that, that you can see that. Now, I guess the real thing that we want to answer is, let's say you have the person in the bad category where they're eating protein and their blood glucose goes up due to perhaps poor insulin signaling or poor insulin sensitivity, and maybe you would say relatively too much glucagon or a normally functioning glucagon in the face of poorly functioning insulin. How do we, and let's assume that maybe ceramides have something to do with that. How do we reverse that situation? What do you think is the most efficacious way to do that? I know you've got some thoughts on fasting. Are you seeing that being demonstrated pretty regularly?
It's a fascinating question. And your question is that, hey, what should we do with this person who is insulin resistant, and when they eat even a protein meal, despite their insulin going up, their sugars are going up, the glucagon is going way high, and we're not really sure what that glucagon is doing. Because Dr. Unger said that for an insulin-resistant person to become a diabetic, you do need glucagon excess. Without glucagon excess, insulin resistance in and of itself doesn't cause the harm. I don't know how true that is, because high insulin itself downregulates its insulin receptors and all that. So here are my thoughts. And I don't think anybody has the answer quite yet. I think in that specific situation, fasting alone may not help. It may help to a certain degree. It may take a large amount of, it may take a long time for your insulin signaling to become normal. However, I think what would help it would be to improve insulin action. And in that situation, I think that I tell my patients that you need to exercise in a fasted state. Because when you exercise in a fasted state, you are improving insulin signaling. As you know, that you can dump glucose into your muscles even without insulin action. As you know, you enhance the ability of GLUT4 translocator to function much more appropriately in the setting of exercise. And there have been multiple studies that I've done that show that people who exercise, their insulin signaling is so good that compared to a sedentary individual, they need far lower amounts of insulin to maintain better blood sugars. So what I'm trying in these patients is a combination of fasting, but more specifically exercise in the fasted state. So exercise in the fasted state makes your insulin function better. It makes your muscles rely more on fat for fuel, and it gives time for the body to heal the insulin receptor. Now, whether that is going to work or no, I don't know for sure. But as a practitioner, I see success in my patients who do that.
And I think that is the bottom line is where you're seeing success, because I think it's fascinating to talk about all these metabolic pathways, and they become more and more complicated the more you study them. You see there's more and more factors that affect them, and it just I really like to reduce it to input output and assume everything in the middle. There's a lot of things that are happening. I know that's very simplistic, but at the end of the day, what's actionable? And I would totally agree with you, is exercise, fasted state, I think work. It depletes glycogen, as you know. The question I have is, what is considered fasted? Because if we say I'm going to drink, a big thing of Gatorade, I mean, we know the absorption profile that is quickly going to raise our blood glucose. It's quickly going to start to refill our glycogen stores. If I eat something that's slower absorbed, fat, for instance, it sits in my stomach, and doesn't really get absorbed. Is that still almost like being fasted? I mean, I'm just wondering, or are the incretin hormones having an impact that's changing the milieu and changing our ability to burn fat and burn glycogen? Because, if I eat, like, one of the things I've noticed, and a lot of people will see that, is, we see this in endurance athletes. They'll complain, they'll be doing exercise, and they'll be taking all these sugary gels in, and they'll have GI upset, and they'll have cramping, and they'll have a lot of negative things. But there's other people that will sit there, like I've done it myself. I've eaten a large meal of steak, fatty steak, and I can literally go do whatever I want, exercise within 30 minutes, and I don't have the GI discomfort. So I just wonder, when you define fasting, is it fasting from carbohydrates? Is it fasting from all foods? I know you're a proponent of coffee and fasted exercise, black coffee. So what do you think that means when you say fasted?
All are very fascinating questions, and I think that it depends as to who you are, how metabolically healthy you are. Let's say we take somebody who is as metabolically healthy as you are. And so in a situation like yours, I don't think there will be any trouble in you consuming either carbs or protein or fat and exercising, because it's really not going to impact the health of your fat cells or the way your incretin hormones are going to interact with your pancreas. So that situation is very different. But let's take an obese individual who is insulin resistant, who's got high triglycerides, high fatty acids, borderline elevated sugars. So in that individual, the goal is to empty their fat cells. The goal is to make their fat cells less inflamed. The goal is to make their fat cells respond to insulin better so that they prevent the release of inappropriate amount of fatty acids into the bloodstream. So in these individuals, if they're going to take Gatorade, some of it may stay in their stomach and not get absorbed, just like you're talking about the cramping that some of these individuals get. But I think some of it does get absorbed. But even if it doesn't get absorbed, there is an incretin effect. The GIP may go up. Many of the intestinal hormones may go up and already give signals to the pancreas to start elaborating either insulin or glucagon. So the net effect may be the same. And so I think that if you are metabolically unhealthy and you want to get healthy, you should exercise in a truly fasted state in which you have no calories in your stomach. You're neither taking protein, nor fat, nor carbs. You're mobilizing the fat from your fat cells, and instead of converting them to ceramide, you are using those fatty acids for fuel and fat oxidation or converting them to ketones. And the best way to achieve that is not just exercise, but after you finish exercise, the process now starts accelerating in terms of ketosis. The fall in insulin is not so much during exercise as it is after exercise. So you should wait for a period of about 4 to 6 hours to derive the benefits of all the hard work you have done, because this is the time in which the body is going to start making provisions for the brain to be fed through ketones. You may learn that, hey, I'm really not hungry after exercise. I can handle and I can wait 3 to 4 hours, 6 hours, and stuff like that. Now, the situation with caffeine is very similar to what I told you. Caffeine does the following things. It definitely does lipolysis through a couple of actions. One of them is through adrenaline. The other one of them is through phosphodiesterase. People don't need to know that, but there are a couple of biological actions of caffeine that increases the release of fat from the fat cells. Caffeine also increases your epinephrine or adrenaline levels. So when your epinephrine level goes up, you feel the energy to exercise. You get like a kick. Okay, saying, hey, I feel like I have the energy to exercise. That's another benefit. Caffeine does increase thermic energy. You start losing heat. Instead of fuel going through oxidative phosphorylation, in which the fuel is being used and it's being converted to ATP, which is the energy currency of the body, the fuel is burnt, and instead of creating energy, you release heat. So some of the effect of caffeine is thermic fuel burning, so to speak, just burning to generate heat. The increase in fat oxidation itself, that means burning the fat to convert to usable fuel, which is ATP, or reusable energy currency, which is ATP, is not that much with caffeine at all. So if you are a sedentary, obese individual with insulin resistance, if you're just solely depending on caffeine to get you healthy in the fasted state, it ain't going to happen. So you need to combine the caffeine at that time and increase your exercise so that the lipolysis that happens with caffeine, the increase in epinephrine that you get with caffeine, is now used so that you can improve insulin resistance through exercise, you can improve fat oxidation through exercise. So that's my point. I think that use something that is permissible in the right way. And in the right way in my mind is to do the few things that I pointed out. So you picked up on that. I'm glad that you're asking me these questions, because I get a chance to tell your audience that, hey, these are some of the new YouTube videos I've put out. Please look them up.
Yeah, I will. Nadir, let me just give you a plug. He puts out excellent videos. They're well worth doing. They're very well produced. You do a very nice job of kind of really, starting with the basis and extrapolating and expanding. And there's another video you put out that I wanted to touch on, because we're talking about generating ketones in response to exercise, particularly exercising in the fasting state. And yet, in one of your videos, you talk about ketones are for the brain. The muscles don't use it very, very, very much of it. So why would exercise generate ketones if it's all for the brain? I mean, I just want your thoughts on the physiology of why that's occurring.
That's such a fascinating question. Is that ketones are that YouTube video that I put out, do we understand ketones well and ketogenic diet well? I spent at least like 3 months gathering all the information. I think it's the reason is that the brain cannot use fatty acids as fuel. It cannot burn fatty acids. So our body has evolved in such a way that it makes a replacement fuel for the brain instead of glucose. Because evolutionarily, I think we didn't have food all the time. We went through multiple periods of intermittent and long-term fast. We couldn't find food. So the body has to figure out a way to feed the brain. Otherwise, we would have all perished, especially since the brain cannot use fatty acids. The muscles can use fatty acids. So if you look at the utilization of muscles of ketones, the saturation kinetics indicates that the muscles can kind of take about 2% at maximum ketone production. They can probably use only about 2% of their energy, 2 to 7% maybe at the most, of their energy from ketones. Whereas the brain can convert to 66 to 70% of its energy used from ketones. So we have evolved in such a way that the ketone receptors, the ketone translocators in the brain don't get saturated at the highest ketone production easily. They remain at a fairly constant rate, whereas as the ketone levels go up, the utilization of ketones by the muscles goes down. And it is the design of that, the evolutionary design of that is quite straightforward. And the reason it's straightforward is that the muscles can burn fatty acids, the brain cannot. So the ketones are directed towards the brain and not towards muscle use. And that's one of the reasons why I question the use of exogenous ketones, because you give exogenous ketones to somebody, it really is not going to contribute that much to muscle energy metabolism. It's going to contribute a very small amount. And you want to make ketones by emptying your fat cells. You don't want to prevent that process, because emptying our fat cells is one of the most health promoting activities you can do. And the reason is that when your fat cells are empty, when you eat fat, there is room to pack the fat in. So this fat recycling, in other words, emptying the fat cells and refilling them when you eat, is a process that should happen in an optimal way. If your fat cells are already full, that's not going to happen. And if you're taking exogenous ketones, the body will have less incentive to empty your own fat cells. And that's my argument against exogenous ketones at this time. I bet more research needs to be done. There may be a place for them, maybe in situations of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. But at this stage, I find it very hard that metabolically otherwise non-demented people, but metabolically unhealthy people should be taking in exogenous ketones to improve their health. I find that a little hard to swallow at this time, because I don't think we have the data to prove that yet.
And do you know if, I'm just wondering, does brain energy consumption go up during exercise? Do we know if that's been looked at? Do we increase our brain energy requirements as we're exercising, or is it because we're thinking real hard? I'm just trying to think what would drive brain energy utilization up, because I'm sure sleeping it goes down. I think maybe I'm wrong on that too, but have you looked into brain energy utilization and what affects it?
What I have been told, what I have read, is that the brain demands a certain amount of energy all the time, whether we are sleeping or whether we are awake. It needs an equivalent of about, and I think this number is right, about 6 or 8 grams of glucose per hour. So it's going to get that 6 to 8 grams of glucose per hour regardless of whether you're sleeping or exercising or thinking. I do know that there is insulin signaling in the brain that's very important for our memory. There are a huge number of insulin receptors in several different locations. One of them is the memory forming and the connections between different neurons, which is called the hippocampus. So hippocampus is very high in insulin receptors. And there is talk that glucose goes into the brain without the help of the GLUT4 receptor, or the GLUT4 transporter. Whereas in the hippocampus, you do need the GLUT4 translocation is improved in the presence of insulin. So the hippocampus is taking in extra glucose when insulin signaling is happening. And this is my another question that I want to explore, and I have not come across the answer quite yet, is that exercise is highly beneficial for our brain function, for our cognitive function, to prevent dementia. Why is that the case? And the question, and the real question that I'm asking here is that, is the case like that because we are improving insulin signaling in the brain so that you need less insulin? Is the hippocampus, the GLUT4 receptor, translocated better in the presence of exercise so that the hippocampus becomes more sensitive to insulin action in the presence of exercise? These are the kinds of questions that we need to drive the research into. And that'll probably help all of us.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, some of the brain research out there, and I know a lot of people consider dementia type 3 diabetes, and there's quite a bit going on in there. Let me ask you about this is kind of shifting gears one last time. Somebody was asking about fat, and I think the term they're looking for is personal fat threshold. Your cells get stuffed with so much fat, and whether they can either hypertrophy or hyperplasia can occur. At some point, the fat cells cannot take any more fat. What is going on in that situation, and what happens to the fat then? If you've got this circulating free fatty acids or triglycerides in the blood, and the fat cells are saying we can't even take any more fat because we're insulin resistant, and insulin helps facilitate fat uptake. What's going on with the fat there? Where does it go? Is this now that it leaves the true adipose tissue and becomes ectopic fat? Is this where we get the liver fat, the pancreatic fat, the visceral fat, the intracellular fat? What's the story there?
Fascinating again. So personal fat threshold is something that Ted Naiman talks a lot about. I got into this area because of one of his talks at Low Carb Denver, maybe it was Breckenridge about 3 or 4 years ago. Ted talked for 30 minutes, and he talked so fast that I remember that I listened to his talk 40 times so that I could get each and every point by pausing and thinking and pausing and thinking. But just like you explained, a personal fat threshold is a situation in which your fat cells are full, they are inflamed, they have white blood cells, macrophages, they have cytokines. Cytokines are chemicals that get released when there is inflammation around. And what's happening to these fat cells is that they can no longer pack in the fat into them, the fat that you have eaten. And it takes a large amount of insulin to get fat into these fat cells. So your insulin levels are already high. The liver is insulin resistant. An insulin resistant liver is very different, I think, and I agree with Ben Bickman out here, is that an insulin resistant liver is resistant to shutting off sugar production by the liver. By the way, I conflate sugar and glucose as one another. But high insulin levels should make the liver suck up the sugar from the circulation and store it as glycogen. Whereas in an insulin resistant state, the liver, instead of sucking up the sugar, is spewing out sugar into the circulation. And you would think that one of the actions of insulin also is fat metabolism. So insulin takes the fat in and it converts that fat to triglycerides, it esterifies it and puts it out into the circulation. So you would think that an insulin resistant liver should stop taking in the fat, esterifying it, and re-putting it out into the circulation. But that's not what is happening. It's insulin resistant as far as sucking up the sugar is concerned. It's spewing out sugar. But it is not insulin resistant at preventing lipogenesis. In other words, taking in fatty acids and throwing it back out as VLDL. The VLDL production in hepatic insulin or liver insulin resistance is up. So the liver is taking this fat and spewing it out. It has no place to go. It cannot be packed back into the fat cells. The muscles say, hey, we can't burn it. We don't have the machinery to burn this fat. So what is happening to this fat is the question. And this fat then ends up in our heart, in our pancreas, in our liver. This is what is called visceral obesity. This is a person who's exceeded his personal fat threshold, in which the fat cells that are designed to protect us, designed to keep us healthy when we eat excessively, can no longer do that. And the fat is now ending up in our organs. And Roger Unger is one of the ones who pointed out through the work of Lydia Shishipang that in a person who is insulin resistant, you can measure the severity of insulin resistance by seeing how fatty the pancreas is. In other words, how much pancreas has accumulated fat, and you can measure that with certain MRI and other imaging studies. So just like you pointed out, personal fat threshold has exceeded when you start getting fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, when you get fatty pancreas, when you get fat around the heart. And like Ben Bickman, along with Dr. Unger, has pointed out, is that it is not just regular old triglycerides, a diacyl glycerol, but this is toxic fat. This is taking fatty acids and attaching serine to it. Serine is a breakdown product of protein metabolism, combining the two and making ceramide, which is a toxic fat that destroys the cell membranes, that destroys the location where insulin receptor is, where it messes up insulin signaling, where it destroys the mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy producing engines inside our cells. So there is mitochondrial dissolution. So I'm glad that you're talking about personal fat threshold, because that's something that a lot of practitioners are not aware of. And it's important to figure out how to know where your personal fat threshold is through clinical evaluation. So if you do a clinical evaluation in somebody and you see that this person has high insulin, high triglycerides, low adiponectin levels, this is by definition somebody who has exceeded their personal fat threshold. Adiponectin, by the way, is a hormone that fat cells elaborate when they are happy and healthy. When they are not healthy, the levels of adiponectin go down. When the fat cells are healthy, the level of adiponectin is high. When this situation is happening, there are other markers. Your liver enzymes are elevated. Your inflammation markers like CRP, like ferritin, like GGT, all of these are high. So these are the kinds of evaluations that a low-carb practitioner should get pretty facile with so that they can counsel their patients properly. So it's a very long answer to a fascinating question you asked, Sean.
Nadir, I have one last question, because I want to be respectful of your time, and I would love to do this again with you because there's so much material that we could go back and forth. So there's a drug, I think it's called Pioglitazone. It's Actose, which I think one of the effects is it prevents the storage of visceral fat and shuttles it into subcutaneous fat. And I'm just wondering, because I see this anecdotally, some people go on a low carbohydrate diet, maybe a carnivore diet. They initially gain weight, but their metabolic markers improve. Their glucose improves, their LFTs improve. I'm just wondering if, because they become more insulin sensitive, their personal fat threshold has gone up a little more. They can carry more subcutaneous fat, all the while they're losing visceral fat. Do you think that is a credible theory that that could be happening? And then as time goes by, that we see often is they initially gain weight or gain body fat, but then they start to lose weight doing the exact same thing. Is it plausible that they've shifted visceral fat into subcutaneous fat? You think that's something that could happen in your experience, or what are your thoughts on that?
Fascinating again. I don't think I have paid that much attention to that specific aspect that you talk about. I do come across people with pioglitazone or lactose use all the time. We should talk about that for a second. But in response to your real question, which is that people going on a carnivore diet, high protein, high fat, initially gaining weight, that might be subcutaneous fat, that might not be visceral fat. They may be becoming insulin sensitive. That's a good thing to look into. And I think these are the people in whom you may need to look at markers of insulin sensitivity and resistance. In terms of the actors or the pioglitazone, if I can put in a little two cents of my own clinical observation, I have a love-hate relationship with that drug. And the reason is that for sure it improves insulin sensitivity. It improves insulin signaling. It prevents visceral adiposity. It improves the health of the fat cells because the fat cells can now pack in more fat. My problem with the actors is that it's a PPAR gamma agonist. PPAR gamma is a chemical in the brain that when activated promotes feeding behavior. It wants you to eat more. So on one hand, you are improving insulin sensitivity, but on the other hand, you're shooting yourself in the foot by having to eat more. So I'm not sure that I can completely subscribe to pioglitazone that wholeheartedly, because overall, I think that the effects are negative. The degree of benefit, I've been a clinician now since 1985. But I can tell you the magnitude and the degree of benefit somebody can get from a combination of an animal source food diet. You and I have had that conversation before. I think as humans, we were designed to eat an animal source food diet. We can add small amounts of fiber to promote colonic health, and we can debate that back and forth. It might be good for somebody, may not be good for another person. But that is one aspect of health. The second aspect of health is fasting. If you're not doing intermittent fasting, I don't think you're cycling your fat cells. We are designed to empty and use the junk that we have accumulated. And if you're not fasting, you're not going to do that. And the third thing is to preserve our muscle mass, give a reason for our muscle mass to build, to improve the way insulin receptor works. And I think that improves our brain function also, is exercise. When you combine all these three techniques, because people have done different things. They've gone on a calorie restriction and gotten benefit. They've gotten on fasting and have gotten benefit. They've gotten exercise and gotten benefit. What the low carb community is good about is that it is talking about combining all these three. And when you combine all these three, the degree of benefit far outweighs any pharmaceutical agent that anybody can prescribe to you. And that's where we need to get good at. We need to figure out how best to combine this in the right way for an individual person.
Yeah, I agree totally, Nadir. I think, just the reference to the Actos was the fact that they're just shifting visceral to subcutaneous. But yeah, I'm absolutely on board with exercise, fasting. And I think the nuance around fasting is it doesn't have to be 3 days of fasting. It could be 16 hours. It can be eating infrequently. I subscribe to the fact that my diet makes me eat infrequently due to satiety signals. It's not that I sit there with a stopwatch to say I must fast for exactly 18 hours. Now, some people, they need those external cues, or some people even have to do it longer. But I do think not eating every 2 to 3 hours like the average American does is a good thing. mean, that's clear. I mean, even if you think about if you go back into our ancestral origins, it would be very impractical for you, particularly if you were a wandering nomadic group, to stop and eat every 2 to 3 hours. I think you would make the rest of the little clan very unhappy if you said, hey, I got to stop and eat again. It just wouldn't work very well. You don't have Tupperware containers to carry around, so anyway. Nadir, this has been wonderful. Like I said, we usually run about an hour. We've just gone over a little bit of this. Can you tell people where to find you on YouTube, how to get a hold of you, where you're on social media? And I'd really love to do some more of this if you're so gracious enough to do this at some time.
I'd love to come back, Sean. Just before I kind of plug in my information, I couldn't agree with you more. I don't think everybody needs to do 3 and multiple day fasts. Intermittent fasting is variable for different people. Somebody as muscular as yourself, as metabolically healthy as yourself, can just base it based on cues on when your body is asking you to eat. And so 16 hours, 18 hours, even less may be good. A metabolically unhealthy person may need to do long-term fasts. So I leave it at that with that. But I really need, and maybe I have been so sort of, I should say, pseudo-scholarly that I have missed out on asking your community of followers, my community of followers to help me. And I really want people to help me here. And I want them to go to my YouTube channel and give it a thumbs up and subscribe so that my name gets out. I get a lot of online counseling to do on patients so that I have to spend 0 time in the cath lab, that I can spend more time on this and devote more time to creating better YouTube videos, better content for all of us. So I want you to put my name in YouTube, Nadir Ali MD. You'll get a lot of my YouTube videos. Click and subscribe. I want you to go to Eat Mostly Fats YouTube channel, do the same. You can go to IDM and the fasting method. You will find me there. If appropriate and useful for you, because it's impossible for a person who's not into this area on a day in and day out basis, not living this, dreaming this, sleeping this, to understand all the nuances to get the right advice. And if you need advice from me, counseling from me, find me through my office. You will get my office number in Google, or find me through IDM, because I want to do more online counseling. I want to do more of this stuff and less of cardiology, because I think that's where my real talent is at this point in my career. I've been a really good interventional cardiologist like Sean was, an orthopedic surgeon, but we have a different calling right now, and I want to follow that calling, and I want people to help me in that. So that's my little plea to your followers, Sean.
Well, I'll tell you what, Nadir, you're definitely, we would consider a friend of what we do, and I certainly encourage anybody that's looking for a physician. Are you isolated to Texas due to licensure, or are you able to practice in multiple states right now, just so people that know that?
Yeah, like if you need, if you just need advice, you can look me up through any place in the world. But if you actually want me to write prescriptions, order tests for you and things like that, which many people don't, then I am licensed in Texas and Michigan. I should probably get licenses in all the different states in the United States, but that's going to take some time.
It's not cheap.
And it's not cheap.
Yeah,
right.
No, I think that's great, Nadir. That's wonderful, and certainly, like I'd encourage anybody from our community that is looking for, advice from a physician, to look up Dr. Ali. He's wonderful, as you guys noticed from hearing from him. So thank you so much. Looking forward to more. I definitely enjoy your videos, so keep putting them out, and I do think this is something we need to understand as physicians in general. The physicians that want to make an impact need to understand where leverage comes from. and you can put your head down and do research and stay in the lab and see your patients in practice, your impact is going to be relatively small. When you start to open it up and you start reaching thousands and thousands of people, your reach is much bigger. And I think that's just something that people need to understand. So utilize the technology and don't hesitate. Jump in with both feet and just get going and start. And you'll be surprised how rapidly. If you put out something good and you have good content and it helps people, people are going to eat it up. And I think that's something that to understand is just physicians and content creators in general. So thank you again, Nadir. I'll see everybody back tomorrow. And Nadir, I'll send you an email on that Newberg guy. So if you want to read that stuff, because it's one of those things it's behind a paywall, and some people use things like Sci-Hub, although I unofficially say that, if you know about Sci-Hub. But anyway, Louis Newberg is Newburgh, I think. So it's an unusual spelling for Newberg.
Is that on Medline or it's not on Medline?
Well, I mean, you can get the abstract, but I mean, it's it's a 1920s paper.
1920s, so it's you. Okay.
You know how they're written. They're not very helpful in the abstract.
If you have a PDF of that, I would appreciate that.
I'll see if I can find one.
The paywall and all that would restrict access to that. You're right.
Exactly. Okay, guys. See you tomorrow. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye now.